Hey everyone, so today we're going to be talking about World War One again, and really specifically the different types of warfare that were used in World War One. World War One is one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. It is, and most of that was because of the technological advances. The way we typically fight wars to now is not as person on person as it used to be. You used to have soldiers really doing more one-on-one or battling on the battlefields in hand-to-hand kind of, but with weapons. Nowadays, we tend to do more by airplanes, by missiles. But back then, it was the advancements of technology that we're going to go into. One thing I don't think that most people are aware of in this class is the connections to the royal family. So one thing I want to touch back on from the last lecture was the alliances and how different alliances were formed. One thing that I think is interesting is that why it took England so long to join the conflict when Russia and Germany and other countries had already joined the conflict. And I think one thing to remind everyone is that the King of England, the King of Russia, known as a Tsar, and William of Germany were all first cousins. So it was for England, it was a choice really between cousin and which was more beneficial. So this is a picture that has been colorized because color photos obviously weren't available. But these are the kings of England and Russia. And so the one on the left is actually the King of England, George, and the one on the right is Tsar Nicholas. So they were first cousins. In fact, many people often would remark that they could be twins. So most of the royal families involved in World War One were related. So for example, the King of Germany was also first cousins with the King of England, but he was also second cousins with the King of Russia. The King of Belgium was also related, and many of their wives were married or were sisters or cousins. So there was a lot of family interaction, and it really stems back from Queen Victoria trying to marry her children throughout Europe in order to create alliances and familial relations that would prevent warfare that actually ended up doing the opposite. So that's just a pause back to that. So our objectives today is to do some investigation into why there are stalemates, how technology made it different, and then just look at how the war progressed and how colonies were brought into it. So make sure you have those written down in your notes so that you can refer back to them. Also, make sure you pause the video and write down the vocabulary terms that will come up in the quiz. So how and where was World War I fought? So the big takeaway here was that the new technology had created a situation in which you could kill people or soldiers very, very quickly. But because both sides had these new technologies and hadn't advanced to a place where they were able to deploy them from a safer distance, it really did create the most deadly conflict in human history. So we're going to be talking about trench warfare specifically today. Because World War One is called the Great War because it was fought mostly in Europe, but really it spread all over the world. So the Scheifelen plan. So Germany's big plan was to really quickly have victory in the West and then turn fast and fight Russia to the East because they had enemies on both sides of their borders. And so the thought was if they could eliminate the threat to the West while Russia was really building itself up, they could just eliminate that, conquer, and then turn their forces against the East. But unfortunately for them, Russia really got prepared and ready for war a lot faster than Germany had expected. So they had no choice. They had to split their army in half, and they had to fight on both sides. So you start to see the British quickly joining the French, making a quick German victory impossible. So England, even though he's first cousins with both Kaiser Wilhelm and with the Tsar Nicholas, he decides to side with the French and the Russians against the Germans. So what they would do is they would dig these major trenches in the ground, and it was like tunnels, like almost like anthills, where they would be, and they would surround it with barbed wire to prevent counterattacks. But over the course of the war, these lines almost never moved. The area between these two areas is actually considered no man's land. In class, I typically show the scene from Wonder Woman where she crosses the no man's land, so you can kind of see what that's like. But each side basically launches attacks, and they just basically have to bear down where they are. So you can see the soldiers in the trench here. They ate in the trench. They slept in the trench. It was wet. It was dirty. They would get infections. They would get what's called trench foot, which don't Google that. You don't want to see it. But basically, it would attack their feet from being wet and dirty all the time, and their feet would almost start to rot. So, one of the issues is that there's new technology. So, gone are the days where you could fire maybe one bullet a minute. We have these rapid fire machine guns. And so, entire like waves of soldiers would just be, you know, decimated as they tried to take the area. They had long range artillery guns, which would mean that they could shoot from farther back. And then this poison gas, which has since been banned because of how painful and horrifying it was. Um, Poison gas, they would launch these like mustard gases into the trenches, and it would cause either death or blinding or choking, sometimes long term illnesses. They had tanks which would move above and through the trenches because they could roll the top. And it made the battle sites expand. So no longer were we just fighting on the ground. This was the first war where we had air and water fights, like underwater fights, because obviously ships. But the Zeppelins were these big balloons that were filled with gas, and they would bomb the coastline with them. Airplanes were having these dogfights, but they weren't really useful yet. They couldn't be produced enough to make a big difference, and they couldn't fly far enough to really make a big difference. But they were changing the face of warfare. One of the biggest impacts is the U-boats, or the undersea boats, or the submarines that would sink ships. That was the plan, is basically if you could cut off the supply chains for different groups. So if you have troops outside Germany and you're trying to bring supplies to them, you don't have to worry about beating them if you can starve them into submission. So that was the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, the casualty was just as high, but just as indecisive. Neither side could get a win. It was just constantly beating each other up and destroying one another. Russia, however, was not prepared for a long term war. They were not as industrialized. Germany was the industrial leader of the world. They were not as wealthy. Their soldiers sometimes didn't even have weapons. They were just sent into battles. They had the sheer numbers. Eventually, you're going to see in that Balkans area again, the Southern Europe in 1915 is going to break out in war. And Bulgaria is going to side against Serbia with the Central Powers, which sort of makes it the lonely group in the area. Romania joined the Allies to fight against Hungary. And you see Italian troops joining the Allies, but needed help from the British and French to protect their own position. So they joined, but really for their own benefit. The Ottoman Empire is going to side with the Central Powers, which is one of the reasons that it no longer exists. They soon were able to do exactly what I talked about in the earlier slides, which was cut off supply routes to Russia. And so the Allies are going to become trapped, trying to reopen this connection in the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. After losing more than 200,000 soldiers, they finally gave up. Now, the Turkish Armenians that were living in the Ottoman Empire who had tried to help the Russians, basically, this is going to be one of the things that kickstarts the genocide against the Armenians, which is one of the reasons why in Rhode Island today we have a very large Armenian population. The Ottoman Empire also faced these uprisings. So many of these older empires, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, were very weak, and the groups that were being controlled by them were sort of tired of that control, so they saw the war as an opportunity. So a lot of the colonies were loyal to the groups coming in, hoping that they could get their independence after the war, hoping that they could control the outcome that was being presented to them. So you start to see these areas really start to turn on their colonial oppressors. So eventually, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand were required to send troops to support England. You start to see these massive recruits, which really helped finalize the war. So the biggest takeaway from the trench warfare is just how much death and chaos was caused for almost no gains, and how this is a turning point in Europe where you really start to see the colonial lines shifting.